September 3rd, 2012. A Monday afternoon in Medellin. A 69-year-old woman walks out of a butcher shop carrying meat for dinner, and a motorcycle pulls up beside her. Florida convicted her of 3 murders. The detectives who chased her counted more than 200. This is why the real Griselda Blanco story is worse than Scarface. Section 1. Medellin, 1943. Griselda Blanco Restrepo was born on February 15, 1943. Most sources give her birthplace as Cartagena, on Colombia's Caribbean coast. Others say Santa Marta, a few hours further east along the same stretch of shoreline. The disagreement has never been settled, and it is the first of many places where her life story splits into 2 versions before it has properly started. What is not disputed is where she grew up. Her mother, Ana Lucia Restrepo, moved the family to Medellin when Griselda was around 3 years old. Medellin in the late 1940s was not the city it would later become. It sat in a narrow valley in the department of Antioquia, ringed by steep green mountains, and it was in the middle of turning itself from a regional trading town into the industrial center of Colombia. Textile mills were opening, money was moving, and people were arriving from the countryside faster than the city could build places to put them. The reason they were arriving matters, because it shaped everything about the world she was raised in. On April 9, 1948, a popular politician named Jorge Eliezer Gaitan was shot dead on a street in Bogotá. The rioting that followed burned much of the capital, and the political violence spread out from there into the rural departments and did not stop for a decade. Colombians call that period La Violencia. Estimates of the dead run to around 200,000 people. Families in the countryside were burned out of their farms, and hundreds of thousands of them walked toward the cities because the cities were the only places left. Medellin absorbed them by letting them build on the hillsides. The flat land in the valley floor was already taken, so the new arrivals put up houses on the slopes above it, 1 room at a time, out of whatever they could carry up. Those neighborhoods had no formal water supply, no sewers, and no legal claim to the ground underneath them. They also had no real police presence, which meant the rules inside them were made locally. Griselda Blanco grew up in that arrangement, in a household that by every account she or anyone else ever gave was poor, unstable, and violent. Her mother has been described in most accounts as an alcoholic who worked as a prostitute. Blanco's own later statements, and the accounts given by people who knew her decades afterward, describe a childhood that included beatings and sexual abuse. She left home somewhere in her early teens. This is the part of her biography that comes almost entirely from interviews given long after the fact, some of them by people with reasons to make her sound larger than she was, and none of it appears in any court record. It should be treated as background rather than as established fact. The same applies, with more force, to the single most repeated story about her early life. In multiple accounts, including ones traced back to Charles Cosby, an American drug dealer who became close to her in the 1990s, Blanco, at the age of 11, took part in the kidnapping of a boy, of around 10, from a wealthy Medellin family. When the ransom was not paid, she is said to have shot him herself. That story appears in books, documentaries, and nearly every article written about her. It has never been supported by a police file, a court document, a named witness, or a contemporaneous news report. It is repeated so often that it reads like a fact, and it is not one. What it does accurately reflect is the reputation she had acquired by the time anyone was writing about her, which was that of a person who had been doing this since childhood. What is better supported is the ordinary criminal work she came up through. She was a pickpocket. She worked the streets and the markets in a city full of people who had arrived with nothing, and she moved into forged documents, which was a thriving trade in a country where hundreds of thousands of people had been displaced and needed papers that said they were someone else. She also, by most accounts, worked as a prostitute as a teenager. None of this made her unusual in Medellin in the 1950s. Thousands of people were doing exactly the same things in exactly the same neighborhoods. The city she was doing it in had a particular character. Antioquia, the department Medellin sits in, has a long-standing reputation across Colombia as the region of traders, and it had built itself on coffee money and then on textiles with local capital and local families. Running alongside that was a second economy. Antioquia and the coast north of it had been moving contraband for generations, because the country's tax and import structure made it profitable to bring things in unofficially. and the families who did it were not regarded locally as criminals in the way a thief was. What that meant for a girl in a hillside neighborhood with no money was that the line between legal and illegal work was not a line she had ever seen anybody respect. The formal economy had almost nothing to offer her. Factory work required references, an address, and a history, and it paid almost nothing. Domestic service meant living in someone else's house for room, board, and a small wage. The informal economy paid better and asked no questions, and Blanco moved into the parts of it that carried the most risk. The document trade she ended up in was a specific product of the period. Hundreds of thousands of Colombians had been displaced by the rural violence, arriving in cities without papers, without property records, and often without any documentary proof of who they were. Others wanted papers that said something different from what the originals said, for reasons ranging from an unwanted marriage to an outstanding warrant. A person who could produce a convincing identity document had a customer base that renewed itself constantly and had relationships with the sort of people who needed one. At around 13, she met a man named Carlos Trujillo. Accounts describe him as a small-time criminal who dealt in falsified papers, which is how the two of them overlapped. They married. Between then and her mid-20s, they had 3 sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo, all of whom carried the Trujillo name, and all of whom would end up in the family business. By the time she was 26, all 3 had been born. The marriage ended, and this is the second story that follows Blanco everywhere and cannot be verified. She and Trujillo are widely said to have stayed business partners after separating, and she is widely said to have had him killed after a deal went wrong. The claim appears in nearly every account of her life. It has never been the subject of a Colombian prosecution, a named investigation, or a public case file. Trujillo is the first of the 3 husbands she is credited with killing, and the total of 3 is repeated as if it were a finding of fact rather than a piece of reputation that hardened over 40 years. The reason the reputation stuck is worth explaining, because it is central to everything that came later. In the Medellin underworld she grew up in, a woman running her own crew was rare enough to require an explanation, and the explanation people reached for was that she must be more dangerous than the men around her. That belief did work for her. It got her taken seriously, in rooms where nobody would otherwise have taken her seriously at all. Blanco understood the value of it, and never once tried to correct it. The business she entered was contraband before it was drugs. Colombia's coast had run smuggling routes for generations, moving cigarettes, whiskey, appliances, and anything else that carried a tax on it. The people who ran those routes were called contrabandistas, and they were not a cartel. They were families and crews with boats, trucks, airstrips, and relationships at ports and customs offices. The infrastructure that would later move cocaine into the United States was already there, fully built, moving legal products illegally. Marijuana came first. Through the 1960s, the mountains of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta produced a heavy volume of it, and the same crews that had been running whiskey started running plants north. Blanco was involved in that trade, and so was Trujillo, and so were most of the people she knew. What made her different was not the product. It was that she paid attention to the part everybody else considered boring, which was documents and logistics. Cocaine changed the math entirely, and it changed it in the exact years she was coming up. A kilo of cocaine paste bought in Peru or Bolivia and processed in Colombia could be turned around in the United States for a multiple that no other product came close to. Marijuana was bulky. It smelled. A shipment large enough to be worth the trip was large enough to be seen. Cocaine was compact, nearly odorless in sealed packaging, and worth so much per pound that a single person walking through an airport could carry a shipment that paid for a house. That last point is the one that made her. Nearly every Colombian trafficker in the late 1960s was thinking about boats and planes, because that was how contraband had always moved. Blanco was thinking about people, a person with a clean passport, an ordinary reason to travel, and something well hidden on their body could walk through American customs and go home to Queens without anyone looking twice. The bottleneck was not supply, and it was not demand. It was bodies willing to carry, and papers that would hold up at a desk. She had spent her entire adult life in the forged documents trade. She knew exactly how to produce a passport that would pass, and she knew where to find people desperate enough to use one. Medellin in the mid-1960s was full of them. The city had grown from a few 100,000 people to well over 1 million in a generation, and the hillside neighborhoods held families with no formal work and no path to any. What Blanco was offering was a plane ticket to New York, papers, and more money for one trip than most of them would see in a year of legal work. She recruited women because women drew less attention at customs, and because she could put the product where male officers were unlikely to search. The move north was made with her second husband, a trafficker named Alberto Bravo. Accounts differ on when they met and when exactly they crossed, with most placing the move in the mid to late 1960s. They entered the United States on falsified paperwork and settled in Queens, New York, which by then held one of the largest Colombian communities in the country. Jackson Heights in particular had become a Colombian neighborhood, with Colombian restaurants, Colombian shops, Colombian churches, and enough Colombian families that a Colombian couple with an accent and cash and no clear job was invisible. Blanco was in her 20s. She had 3 young sons, a criminal history that existed in no American file, a set of documents that said she was somebody else, and a supply relationship in a city that was about to become the cocaine capital of South America. Nothing about her at that point suggested what she would become. She was not the biggest trafficker in Colombia. She was not connected to the men who would later be famous. The organization that became known worldwide as the Medellin Cartel had not been assembled yet, and the men who would run it were still teenagers or younger. When Griselda Blanco arrived in New York, the American cocaine market she was about to build a business inside of was small enough that federal agents were not paying serious attention to it. She would spend the next decade fixing that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The pipeline she built out of a Queens apartment ran for the better part of 10 years before anyone in American law enforcement understood what they were looking at. By the time they did, one federal agent had spent months staring at a name on a list of 30 defendants and could not find a single photograph of the person it belonged to. He would spend the next decade looking. Section 2, Queens, New York. The apartment was in Queens, and the business ran out of it the way a small import company would. Blanco and Alberto Bravo were not the first Colombians to sell cocaine in New York. What they did, that almost nobody had done yet, was treat the supply side as a system that could be scaled. Before them, cocaine reached American cities in small amounts, carried by individuals who had their own contacts and worked for themselves. The volume was low, the price was enormous, and the drug was still thought of as an expensive novelty for musicians and people in film. There was no organized pipeline, because nobody had bothered to build one. Blanco built one. The unit of the business was a person on a plane, and everything else was designed around making that person unremarkable. She recruited couriers in Medellin, mostly women, and she chose them for how ordinary they looked. Housewives, grandmothers, young women traveling with children. The point was for a customs officer at an American airport to have no reason to give them a second glance, and in the early 1970s, there was almost nothing that would trigger a search of a middle-aged woman flying in from Bogota. Officers were looking for young men. They were looking for nervousness. They were looking for people who fit the picture that existed in their heads, and Blanco spent years making sure her people did not fit it. The papers came from her own trade. She had grown up around forged documents and had spent years working in that market before she ever touched a drug, and she knew what a passport had to look like to survive a desk check. Couriers traveled under names that were not theirs, with entry stories that held together, and they were coached on what to say. The concealment method is the part that made her name inside the business. Blanco had a set of undergarments designed with hidden compartments sewn into them, girdles and bras built to hold packed cocaine against the body, without changing the shape of the person wearing them. Bob Palombo, the DEA agent who spent more than a decade on her, described it as anything that could carry cocaine and get through the door. A courier wearing that could walk through an airport with several kilos on her and read, to anybody watching, as a woman in an unflattering foundation garment. Volume followed. Instead of one person carrying a large load and risking everything on a single crossing, she sent many people carrying moderate loads on separate flights on separate days. If one was stopped, the loss was contained, and the courier could not identify anyone above the person who had handed her the package. The structure was built to leak in small amounts and to survive doing it. The economics are what made the whole thing worth the risk, and they were extraordinary in a way that is hard to convey now. A kilogram of cocaine that cost a few $1,000s to acquire and process in Colombia was worth somewhere in the region of $50,000 wholesale in New York in the mid-1970s, and considerably more than that once it had been cut and broken down for street sale. The entire cost of moving it, including the courier's fee, the ticket, The documents and the losses from any load that got caught was a rounding error against that spread. A courier was paid $1,000 or $2,000 for a trip. In Medellin, that was a year of ordinary wages. To Blanco, it was a fraction of 1% of what the person carried. There has never been a shortage of people willing to take that trade, and there was certainly no shortage in the neighborhoods she was recruiting from. What that margin also produced was a queue of people wanting in. Every Colombian in New York who understood the numbers wanted a piece of the supply side, and the number of independent operators multiplied through the 1970s. That is the origin of the disputes that would later define the business. There was more than enough money for everybody, and there was no mechanism at all for settling an argument about who was owed what. On the New York side, the distribution ran through the Colombian community in Queens. Jackson Heights by the early 1970s was one of the largest Colombian neighborhoods outside Colombia, with its own restaurants, bakeries, travel agencies, and money transfer offices. Blanco used it the way any immigrant business uses a community, for labor, for cover, and for trust. People who had known each other's families in Medellin were doing the work, and that made the organization hard to get inside of. An American undercover agent could not simply walk into that room. What she was selling into was a market with no competition worth the name. New York's heroin trade had been controlled for decades by Italian-American organized crime, which had the supply routes and the street distribution locked down. Cocaine sat outside that arrangement. It came from a different continent, through a different diaspora, and the established organizations had no relationships in Colombia and no particular interest in building them. Blanco walked into a wide-open market with a direct line to the source, and by the early 1970s, she was supplying a share of the New York cocaine trade large enough to be noticed by people who had never had to notice Colombians before. The money arrived faster than a small operation could handle. Cash came back in volume, in a business with no bank access and no way to explain any of it, which meant it had to be counted, stored, moved, and eventually sent home. That created its own set of jobs and its own set of vulnerabilities, and it is one of the reasons the violence started. Because the violence did start, and it started in New York years before Miami. Colombian trafficking in Queens through the first half of the 1970s produced a steady run of killings that local detectives had trouble making sense of. Bodies turned up with no witnesses in a community that had no interest in talking to police, over debts and shipments that no investigator could reconstruct. Blanco's organization was one of several operating in that space, and it acquired a reputation early for settling disputes by removing the person on the other side of them. Her method of enforcement was already what it would be for the next 15 years. Somebody who lost a load or held back money was not sued, argued with, or cut off. They were killed, and the killing was arranged through people who had no other relationship with the victim and could be sent home afterward. That practice was cheap, it was fast, and it made her close to impossible to charge, because the person who pulled the trigger had usually flown in for the job and flown out again. It also gave her the name that followed her for the rest of her life. In the Colombian trade in New York, she became known as La Madrina, the godmother. She was not the only Colombian trafficker in the city, and she was not the largest, but she was the one people described as the one who would actually do it. New York detectives had no framework for it. Organized crime in the city had been understood for decades through the Italian-American families, which were hierarchical, largely native-born, and thoroughly infiltrated by informants after years of federal attention. The Colombian groups were none of those things. They were recent arrivals, organized around family and hometown ties rather than formal rank, with no history with American law enforcement at all. A homicide in that world produced a body, a neighborhood full of people who had seen nothing, and a victim whose real name was frequently unknown. The press eventually started writing about a Colombian connection, in the way the heroin trade had earlier been given one. What that coverage missed was that the people running it were not an organization in the sense anyone meant. They were dozens of separate operations, supplied from the same country, competing with each other and killing each other over debts. American law enforcement was slow to catch up, largely because the agency that would eventually take her down did not exist for most of the period. The Drug Enforcement Administration was created in July 1973, pulling several existing federal drug offices into one organization. Before that, drug work was split between agencies, with overlapping jurisdictions and competing files, and cocaine sat near the bottom of everyone's priority list because heroin was killing people in visible numbers, and cocaine was not. The case that eventually reached her came out of a New York investigation called Operation Banshee. Bob Palumbo had come into federal work in the early 1970s, hired as a Bureau of Customs agent in New York City after a stretch as a substitute teacher, and was on the ground as the DEA stood itself up. Banshee was the kind of case built the slow way, out of surveillance, wiretaps, street arrests, and informants, working upward from couriers and street-level sellers toward whoever was above them. It took years, and what it gradually assembled was the shape of a Colombian supply network running out of Queens with a structure and a pattern to it. In April 1975, a federal grand jury in the Southern District of New York returned an indictment charging Blanco and more than 30 other people with conspiracy to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine. At the time, it was described as one of the largest cocaine cases the federal government had ever brought. The names on it were mostly Colombian, mostly unknown to the public, and mostly people who had been operating in New York for years without appearing in any American file. One name on that list caused a specific problem. Agents had built a case against Griselda Blanco and could not produce a photograph of her. They had wiretapped calls, they had couriers, they had money movements, they had the accounts of people who had worked for her, and they had almost no idea what she looked like. She had entered the country under a false name and had continued using false names inside it. She had no American arrest record. She had spent a decade running a business through other people and staying off the part of it that touched the street. The indictment did not result in her arrest. Before agents could move on her, Blanco left the United States and returned to Colombia. Accounts of exactly how much warning she had vary, but the outcome does not. Federal prosecutors in New York had a sealed case against a defendant who had gone home to a country that, at that time, would not extradite its own citizens to the United States under any circumstances anyone could arrange. That last fact governed the next 10 years of her life. Colombia's constitution and its politics through the 1970s made extradition of Colombian nationals effectively impossible. A new treaty took effect in 1982, and even then the Colombian president made clear he did not intend to enforce it, and the first Colombian citizens were not actually surrendered to the United States until January 1985. For a Colombian trafficker facing an American indictment, going home was not a retreat. It was a legal firewall. So the 1975 indictment sat. It stayed open, it stayed unresolved, and it followed her for the next decade, like a debt that could only be collected if she made the mistake of standing on American soil under a name somebody could match to it. Bravo went back to Colombia as well, and their partnership did not survive it. What is agreed across accounts is that the two of them met in Bogota at some point in 1975, and that Bravo did not survive the meeting. The version that circulates in almost every telling is that Blanco confronted him over roughly $1.9 million missing from the operation's accounts, that the meeting happened in a parking lot, that both had bodyguards, and that a shootout followed in which Bravo was killed and Blanco walked away. Some versions have her firing the shot herself with a submachine gun. Colombian authorities never charged anyone. The details come from accounts given years later by people in the trade, and no court has ever tested any of them. What can be said plainly is that Alberto Bravo, her partner in building the New York pipeline, and her second husband, died violently in Colombia in 1975, and that Blanco kept the business. Every version of the story agrees on that much. The rest is reputation, and by that point the reputation was doing a great deal of work on her behalf. She was 32 years old. She had a federal indictment in New York she could not be touched for, a distribution network in a country she could not safely enter, 3 sons in their teens, and a supply relationship in a city that was about to become the center of the largest criminal industry in the hemisphere. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 3 years later, she came back into the United States anyway, under a different name, and did not go anywhere near New York. She picked a city where the banks were taking in so much untraceable cash that the Federal Reserve Branch there was reporting a surplus larger than every other branch in the country combined. Section 3. Miami. 1978. Miami in the late 1970s was not chosen at random by anybody. The city sits at the bottom of the Florida Peninsula, roughly 1,300 miles from the Colombian coast, with the entire Caribbean sitting between the two as a set of stepping stones. Florida has more coastline than any state except Alaska, most of it flat, much of it swamp, and almost all of it unwatchable in any practical sense. South of the city, the Everglades run for 100 miles in every direction, empty enough that a light aircraft could put down on a dirt strip at night, and nobody within 20 miles would hear it. The Keys stretched out into the water like a delivery ramp. There were more registered pleasure boats in South Florida than anywhere else in the country, and a boat coming in from the Bahamas at dusk looked exactly like the 10,000 other boats coming in from the Bahamas at dusk. The city also already had the population to absorb the business. The Cuban exile community had been building in Miami since 1959, and by the late 1970s ran a substantial part of the local economy. A Colombian community had grown alongside it. Spanish was a working language across whole sections of the city. A Colombian family arriving with cash and no clear source of income was one of thousands of families arriving with cash and no clear source of income, in a city where that had been normal for 20 years, and the money had nowhere to hide, so it did not bother hiding. This is the part of the period that still sounds invented. The Federal Reserve Branch in Miami tracks the flow of physical currency in and out of the region's banks, and in 1979, that branch reported a cash surplus of several $billion, a figure larger than the surpluses of every other Federal Reserve branch in the country put together. A cash surplus means more paper money coming into the banks than the legal economy could possibly account for. South Florida's tourism, construction, and retail sectors did not generate that. Something else did, and the number sat in a federal report where anybody could read it. Banks took the deposits. Some of them accepted cash brought in by the bagful and counted by machine, and a handful of small institutions were effectively built around the service. Federal money laundering enforcement barely existed at the time, because the statutes that make it a serious crime to move drug proceeds through a bank were largely written afterward, in response to exactly this. Operation Greenback, the federal task force put together to attack the cash side of the South Florida trade, was not stood up until around 1979 and 1980, by which point the pattern was years old. That money built the visible city. The Brickell skyline that appears in every photograph of Miami went up in that period. Construction, real estate, car dealerships, marinas and nightclubs absorbed cash from people who did not need the businesses to be profitable. A city that had been declining through the early 1970s, losing tourism to cheaper destinations, and struggling economically, turned into a boomtown in the space of about 4 years. Griselda Blanco came back into that in 1978, under a false name, on false papers, with a federal indictment against her real one still sitting open in New York. She settled in Miami-Dade County and moved between houses over the following years, rather than staying in one place. She had come back with a third partner, a Colombian trafficker named Dario Sepulveda, who became her third husband. In 1978, they had a son. She named him Michael Corleone Blanco, after the character in The Godfather. That single decision tells more about how she saw herself than any interview she ever gave, and she was entirely sincere about it. The name is on his legal documents. He still uses it. The operation she ran out of Miami was a different animal from the one she had run in Queens. The couriers on planes were still part of it, but the volume had outgrown them. By the late 1970s, cocaine was coming into South Florida by boat and by aircraft in loads measured in hundreds of kilos, and Blanco was positioned in the middle of that flow as both a receiver and a distributor. Product came to her from Colombian suppliers. She broke it down and moved it out to wholesalers in Miami, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and half a dozen other cities where she already had people from the New York years. The figures attached to her operation should be handled carefully because they come from law enforcement estimates, from documentary interviews, and from people with an interest in the legend, and they range wildly. The most commonly repeated claim is that at her peak, she moved around 3,400 pounds of cocaine a month and took in around $80 million a month. Other accounts, including some from investigators who worked her, put the monthly volume at a few hundred kilos. What all of them agree on is that she was one of the largest single distributors operating in the United States, and that the profit was enormous by any measure anyone wants to use. Above her, the Colombian side was organizing itself into the structure that the world would eventually know by name. Through the late 1970s, the Medellin traffickers were consolidating, and the men who would run it were building the routes that made industrial volume possible. Carlos later bought property in the Bahamas and turned an island airstrip into a refueling stop for small aircraft running north, which converted cocaine smuggling from a suitcase business into an air freight business almost overnight. The Ochoa family brought organization and money. Pablo Escobar brought the enforcement structure that eventually swallowed everything else. The loose arrangement between them became a formal one in the early 1980s. The physical mechanics of how a load reached her are worth setting out, because they explain why the volume grew so fast. A light aircraft would leave a strip in northern Colombia carrying several hundred kilos, land somewhere in the Caribbean to refuel, then make a short hop to South Florida, where it either put down on a rural strip in the middle of the night or dropped bundles into the water for boats to collect. On the ground, the load went into a stash house. These were ordinary rented houses in ordinary suburban neighborhoods, chosen because they were unremarkable, with a family or a couple living in them to make the place look normal. The product was stored, broken into smaller lots, and distributed out to wholesalers who came to collect. The people minding those houses were usually low-level, usually Colombian, and usually the only ones who got arrested when anything went wrong. The money came back the same way in reverse, and it was the harder problem. Cocaine sold at street level generates enormous quantities of small denomination bills, which are bulky. $1 million in 20s weighs more than 100 pounds. Organizations in Miami in that period had rooms with counting machines running for hours, and some of them stopped counting altogether and started weighing it instead, because weighing was faster and close enough. Getting it out of the country was done several ways at once. Some went into banks that were not asking questions. Some went through money transfer offices in Colombian neighborhoods, which existed legitimately to let immigrants send wages home and could absorb a great deal of traffic. Some was loaded onto the same aircraft that had brought the product. A great deal of it was spent in Florida on property, cars, boats, and businesses, which is why the visible economy of the city changed so fast. Blanco's relationship to that structure is one of the most misdescribed parts of her story. She is frequently called a leader of the Medellin cartel, and she was not. She was a Medellin trafficker who was operating in the United States before the cartel existed as an organized body, who supplied, and was supplied by the men who ran it, and who was independent enough that nobody above her controlled her Miami distribution. She had her own routes, her own crews, and her own customers. That independence was profitable, and it was also the thing that got people killed, because it meant every dispute she had was hers to settle personally. The Miami market she entered was already occupied. Cuban-American wholesalers had been running cocaine and marijuana into and through the city for years, along with American crews and a range of independent operators. The arrival of Colombians who could supply directly from the source changed the balance immediately. A Cuban wholesaler, buying from a Colombian at one price, could not compete with a Colombian selling at another, and the Colombians did not need the middle layer at all. Through the late 1970s, the Colombian organizations pushed steadily downward into the distribution levels that other groups had held, and they did it in a market with no mechanism for resolving a dispute except force. Blanco's crews were built for that environment. Her brother-in-law, Miguel Sepulveda, known as Paco, handled work for her in Miami and had already been indicted on federal narcotics charges in 1978. Detectives who worked the era described him as a man who looked different in every photograph they had of him. Below and around him were shooters brought in from Colombia on short notice, used and sent home, in a rotation that made the individual killings almost impossible to attach to anyone. The way she lived in Miami was built around not being findable. She did not keep one house. She kept several, moved between them, and used other people's names on the paperwork for all of them. Cars were registered to people who worked for her. Telephones were in other names. Bills were paid in cash. Around her was a network of people whose entire function was to hold things. A house held product. Another house held money. Somebody's girlfriend held documents. A man with no criminal record and a legitimate job held the title to a property. That structure is standard in trafficking organizations now, and was already well developed then, and it meant that when police did find something, what they found belonged on paper to a person with no visible connection to anything. The Colombian community in Miami was much smaller than the Cuban one, and much newer, which cut both ways for her. It gave her a pool of people who spoke the language, understood where she came from, and could be recruited. It also meant that within that community, the people in the business all knew each other, which is why so many of her disputes were with people she had known for years. The lifestyle went with the money. Blanco spent on jewelry, on parties, on houses. Accounts from people who were around her describe a woman who enjoyed being the person everybody in the room was watching, who liked expensive stones, who gave gifts to the people who worked for her, and who could turn on anyone in the room without warning. She used cocaine herself, heavily, and by most accounts her use increased through the early 1980s alongside everything else. What she did not do is keep a low profile in the way a person facing an open federal indictment might be expected to. She was living under false names, but she was living openly, and she was building a reputation in the Miami trade that made her one of the most talked about people in it. People in that business knew who she was, they knew what she was reputed to do, and a substantial number of them owed her money. The debts are the mechanism that turned all of this into a war. Cocaine at wholesale moved on credit. A supplier fronted product to a distributor, who fronted it further down, and payment came back up the chain after the sale. That is how the entire trade functioned, because nobody had the cash to pay up front at volume. It also meant the whole system rested on the certainty that failing to pay was worse than paying. There was no court to go to. The only enforcement mechanism was the reputation of the person owed. Blanco understood that the reputation had to be maintained in public to be worth anything. And by 1979, there were enough Colombian organizations operating in South Florida, with enough outstanding debts between them and enough men and weapons available, that the enforcement stopped happening quietly. Miami-Dade County recorded a rising homicide count through 1978 and into 1979. Detectives were seeing killings with a pattern to them: Colombian victims, machine gun rounds, vehicles left behind, no witnesses. The county's homicide investigators had no particular framework for it, because nothing like it had happened in an American city before. There was no organized crime task force built for Colombians, no informant base inside those neighborhoods, and no expectation that any of it would escalate further. On the afternoon of July 11, 1979, a white Ford Econoline van drove into the parking lot of the largest shopping mall in Miami. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The signs painted on either side of that van did not match each other. The phone number stenciled underneath was disconnected. What was inside it, and what happened over the next 90 seconds in a liquor store between a beauty salon and a deli, gave American police a phrase they still use to describe that entire era. Section 4. Dadeland, July 11, 1979. Dadeland sat in Kendall, a suburban bedroom community, about 10 minutes south of downtown Miami. It covered roughly 50 acres and was the largest shopping mall in the city, the kind of place where families did their weekend shopping and teenagers spent the summer because it had air conditioning. The van came in a little after 2 in the afternoon. It was a white Ford Econoline, and it had been painted with red stencils on both sides, advertising a party supply company. Anybody who looked carefully would have noticed that the two signs did not say the same thing. The words on one side had been put on in a different order than the words on the other. There was a telephone number under the lettering, and the line it belonged to had been disconnected. The driver took the van slowly around the outer edge of the parking lot and then pulled up in front of Crown Liquors, a store squeezed between a beauty salon and a delicatessen on the edge of the mall. A few minutes later, a white Mercedes sedan parked nearby. It had black-tinted windows, and the glass was bulletproof, which by itself said what kind of business the people inside were in. The passenger was German Jimenez Paneso, 37 years old, a trafficker from Medellin, who was one of the larger cocaine dealers operating in Miami. The driver was his bodyguard, Juan Carlos Hernandez, 22. The two men went into the liquor store. It was an ordinary errand. Around 2:30, two men got out of the van carrying submachine guns and walked into Crown Liquors behind them. What happened inside took well under a minute. The gunman opened fire across the store. Paneso was hit repeatedly and died where he fell. Hernandez was hit and made it out of the store into the parking lot before he went down. Two employees of the liquor store, who had no connection to any of it and were working an ordinary Wednesday shift, were shot and wounded. The shooting did not stop at the door. As the gunmen left, they fired into the parking lot. Rounds went into parked cars. Bullet holes were later counted through the front of the store, through the glass, through vehicles that belonged to people who were inside the mall buying groceries. Then the van drove off, crossed the parking lot, and was abandoned at the far end of it. Police found it there. What was inside is the reason the day has a name. The interior had been modified. There were firing ports cut into the sides so that people inside could shoot out without opening the doors. There were bulletproof vests. There was an arsenal of weapons, more than the two men who went into the store had carried, enough for a crew several times that size. Officers at the scene started calling the van a war wagon, and the description stuck in every newspaper account written afterward. One of the officers standing in that parking lot described the people responsible as cocaine cowboys. That phrase left the scene, went into the coverage, and became the name for the entire period. The victims were not random, and the attack was not sudden. What had led up to it was a chain of killings that had been running for more than a year, and it is worth laying out, because it shows how ordinary this kind of thing already was inside the trade before it ended up in a shopping mall. In 1978, there had been a burglary at Jimenez Paneso's home, in which cocaine was stolen. A woman named Esther Rios, who had worked as a maid for his family, was killed during it. A man named Jaime Suescun was believed by investigators to have been responsible. Paneso spent months looking for him. On May 20th, 1979, about 7 weeks before Dadeland, there was a running machine gun battle on the Florida Turnpike. Drivers pulled off the road to get out of the way. A police car was shot at. When investigators worked through it, they found Jaime Suescun dead in the trunk of an Audi, handcuffed and strangled, and 4 more men dead nearby. Paneso was a suspect in that. So by July, the score between the parties involved was already several bodies deep and running in both directions. Miami-Dade detectives believed the Dadeland attack was payback inside that sequence, and they believed the man who arranged it was Miguel Sepulveda, known as Paco, who was Griselda Blanco's brother-in-law at the time. Sepulveda had already been indicted on federal narcotics charges in 1978 and was a fugitive. He stayed one until 1983, when he was arrested in Queens, New York, on a tip from agents in Miami. Detective Raul Diaz, who worked the Colombian cases in that period, described the difficulty of finding him plainly. They had roughly 10 photographs of Paco Sepulveda, and in each one, he looked like a different person. The connection to Blanco herself is the part that needs to be stated carefully, because it is repeated everywhere as a settled fact and it is not one. The version told most often is that Blanco owed Jimenez Paneso a large sum of money, did not want to pay it, and either ordered his killing or gave Sepulveda permission to carry it out. That version comes from investigators' beliefs at the time and from accounts given later by people inside the organization, including Jorge Ayala, who became her chief enforcer. No one was ever convicted of the Dadeland murders. Blanco was never charged with them. In 1979, she was not even a fixed presence in Miami yet, and the operational work in the city was being run through Sepulveda. The link between her and that afternoon rests on the accounts of people who worked for her, given years later, most of them while negotiating with prosecutors. That does not make the accounts false. It does mean the attribution is a police conclusion and an informant's story rather than a courtroom finding. What is not in dispute is the effect. Dadeland was not the first drug killing in South Florida, and it was not even close. The first 7 months of 1979 had already been described as the bloodiest stretch in the region's history, with traffickers and dealers being shot at a rate the county had never seen. But those killings happened in warehouses, on side streets, in cars, at night, to people who were in the business. They stayed inside the world they came from. This one happened at 2:30 in the afternoon, in a liquor store at the biggest mall in Miami, with families in the parking lot and shoppers 100 feet away, and 2 of the people shot were store clerks. That is the line that got crossed, and everybody in the city understood it immediately. The 2 wounded employees are the detail that got lost almost immediately and should not have been. They were people working a shift in a liquor store in a shopping mall, selling wine and beer to suburban customers on a Wednesday afternoon in July. Neither had any connection to cocaine, to Colombia, or to anybody involved. They were behind a counter when 2 men came through the door with submachine guns and started firing across the room. And they were hit because a room is a small space, and a weapon firing at that rate does not distinguish. Every person in that parking lot who came back to find their car shot through was in the same position. So was every shopper who was inside the mall and heard it. The coverage went national. A shootout with submachine guns in an American shopping mall was not something anyone had a reference point for in 1979. Miami's business community, which depended on tourism, watched the story travel and understood what it was going to do to the city's name. The investigation itself ran into every wall that would define the next 3 years. The van was the best evidence anyone had, and it produced almost nothing. It had been prepared in advance, with the firing ports cut and the signage painted on, which told investigators the attack had been planned rather than improvised. It also told them the vehicle had been acquired specifically for the job, which meant it traced back to nobody who mattered. The weapons inside were the sort that could be bought or brought in without a paper trail worth following. There were witnesses, in the sense that a shopping mall on a weekday afternoon is full of people. There were almost no useful ones. Almost nobody had been looking at the liquor store when two men walked into it, and the shooting was over in seconds. The people who did see something described men with guns, which narrowed nothing. The victims were the other problem. Both were Colombian nationals, one of them a significant trafficker who had been involved in a running feud that had already produced several bodies. Reconstructing a motive meant reconstructing an underworld dispute inside a community that had no reason at all to help the police, and the surviving participants in that dispute were not going to give statements. Nobody has ever been convicted for the killings at Dadeland. The case sits, more than 40 years later, as an unsolved double homicide in a shopping mall in front of hundreds of people. The mall reopened. Kendall went back to being a suburb. What did not go back was the assumption that this kind of violence stayed in its own neighborhoods, and everything that followed over the next 3 years confirmed that it did not. The phrase the officer used in the parking lot spread faster than any of the facts did. Cocaine cowboys turned up in newspaper headlines, then in television coverage, then in the way people in Miami talked about the men driving expensive cars around a city that had been fairly poor a few years earlier. It became the shorthand for the entire era, and it is still the phrase used for it now. The police response revealed how far behind law enforcement was. Nelson Andreu, who worked the era as a Miami detective and later became a police chief, described the equipment gap without much decoration. Officers were carrying 6-shot revolvers. The people they were going up against had semi-automatic weapons and submachine guns. Departments had no body armor as standard issue, no rapid response training for anything resembling this, and no intelligence structure aimed at Colombian organizations, because until recently, there had been no reason to build one. There was also almost no chance of a conviction. The shooters had flown in for the job according to the understanding investigators developed, and were out of the country within hours. Nobody in the community would talk. The van gave up forensic material, but no names anyone could match. The one-man detectives were confident about was already a fugitive on other charges and stayed one for 4 years. Inside the trade, the message landed exactly as intended. A debt had been collected in public, in daylight, in front of civilians, and nothing had happened to the people who collected it. Any Colombian organization operating in South Florida that had been weighing whether the risk of open violence was worth it now had an answer. The killings did not slow down after Dadeland. They accelerated, and they kept accelerating for the next 2 years, and the numbers coming out of Miami-Dade County over that period stopped resembling an American city's numbers at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Within a year, the county medical examiner had run out of physical space for bodies and was renting refrigerated equipment from a fast food company to hold the overflow. The homicide rate in Miami was on its way to becoming the highest in the United States, and detectives working those cases began noticing that a specific set of killings all traced back to one supplier. Section 5. The numbers, 1979 to 1981. Dade County recorded around 349 homicides in 1979. In 1980, the figure jumped to roughly 569. In 1981, it went above 600. For a county of about 1.5 million people, that produced a murder rate that made Miami the deadliest city in the United States, and the increase happened over 24 months rather than over a decade. The county medical examiner's office was not built for that. It had been designed and staffed for a city with a normal violent crime problem, and by 1980, it was receiving bodies faster than it could process them. The office ran out of physical storage. The solution was to rent a refrigerated trailer, of the kind used to move food, from a fast food company, and park it outside to hold the overflow. That detail has been repeated so many times that it sounds like an exaggeration invented for a documentary. It is in the contemporaneous reporting, and the medical examiner at the time confirmed it publicly. 2 other things were happening in Miami in exactly those months, and they matter because they explain why the city's institutions had nothing left to give. In May 1980, 4 Miami-Dade police officers were acquitted in the death of Arthur McDuffie, a black insurance salesman who had been beaten after a traffic stop. The verdict set off several days of rioting in Liberty City and other black neighborhoods. 18 people died. Property damage ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The police department spent that period doing nothing but trying to hold the city together. Between April and October of the same year, the Mariel boat lift brought roughly 125,000 Cubans to South Florida in a matter of months, arriving by boat in numbers no federal or local agency was prepared to receive. The overwhelming majority were ordinary families. A small number had been released from Cuban prisons and institutions, and that small number became the story, which produced its own crime wave in the press whether or not it produced one on the street. Either way, the city's police, courts, jails, and social services absorbed a population increase of about 10% inside 6 months. So the peak of the cocaine war landed on a police department that was simultaneously managing a riot and an immigration emergency. Detectives who worked homicide in Miami in 1980 were carrying caseloads that made a full investigation of any single killing close to impossible. The killings themselves were designed to be unsolvable. Blanco's method, as reconstructed later by investigators and by the men who worked for her, was to import the shooters. A person would be brought up from Medellin, told who to kill, paid a few $1,000s, or given a small amount of product to sell, and put back on a plane. He had no history with the victim, no local record, no relationships in Miami, and no reason to ever return. By the time a body was found, the man who had made it was on the other side of the Caribbean. Identification was its own wall. Many of the dead were Colombian nationals living in the United States under false names. They had no American fingerprint records, no dental records anybody could reach, and families who could not be located or would not answer. Miami-Dade homicide detectives in that period had unidentified bodies sitting in files for months, murdered by unidentified people, over disputes nobody would describe. The weapons made the scenes look like something out of a different country. The submachine guns that were showing up, particularly compact machine pistols that could be carried under a jacket, put out a volume of fire that police in an American city had no experience with. Crime scenes had dozens of casings. Vehicles were shot through from one side to the other. Bystanders were hit regularly, because a weapon fired at that rate on a street does not stop at the person it is aimed at. One method that arrived in Miami in those years is credited specifically to Blanco's organization. 2 men on a motorcycle would ride up alongside a target's car in traffic. The passenger did the shooting. The bike went between the stopped vehicles and was gone before anyone could follow it. It requires almost nothing. It works in daylight in heavy traffic, and it is close to impossible to chase. Whether Blanco personally invented it cannot be established. What can be established is that it appeared in Miami during the period her organization was most active there, that investigators and the men who worked for her both attributed it to her crews, and that it went back to Colombia afterward and became the standard method of the sicarios who did contract killing in Medellin for the next 20 years. The technique outlived everyone who used it in Florida. The caseload explains the clearance rate better than anything else. A homicide detective in an ordinary American city might carry a handful of new cases a year and close most of them, because most murders are committed by somebody the victim knew. Miami-Dade detectives in 1980 and 1981 were catching new bodies faster than they could write up the previous ones. A case that did not break in the first week went into a drawer because there was another one waiting, and whole categories of case were written off on arrival. Some of the dead were never identified at all. A Colombian national living in Miami under a false name, killed by people who flew in from another country, with no family who could be located and no fingerprints in any American system, could sit in a county facility for months as a case number. Somewhere in Colombia, a family stopped hearing from a son and never learned why. The federal and local response was slower than the escalation, and when it came in pieces. The first serious attempt at the organizations themselves was a joint unit called CENTAC 26, a central tactical group that put federal agents and Miami-Dade homicide detectives in the same room and pointed them at the Colombian trafficking group specifically. It was small. It ran on the understanding that the ordinary way of working homicides, one case at a time, could not touch an organization that imported its shooters and rotated them out. Instead, the unit tried to build a picture of the structure, the money, and the relationships, and to work backward from the pattern, rather than forward from any single body. The detectives who came out of that work are the reason anything about this period is documented at all. Al Singleton and Nelson Andreu on the local side, Raul Diaz on the intelligence side, and a rotating group of federal agents spent years assembling files on people they could not arrest, in a city where the political priority was to make the coverage stop rather than to make the cases. Singleton, who spent years on Blanco and eventually sat across from her, said afterward that she never showed the slightest sign of regret about having people killed. That is a detective's assessment of a person he investigated for a decade, not a psychiatric finding, and he was clear about what he meant. He was describing someone for whom ordering a death was an operational decision and nothing else. The money side got its own task force. Operation Greenback started around 1979 and 1980 and was the first sustained federal attempt to attack the laundering rather than the drugs. Investigators followed cash into banks that had been accepting deposits in bags, into money transfer businesses, and into the real estate and construction projects going up along Biscayne Bay. The legal tools were weak, because most of the statutes that make moving drug money a serious federal crime were written later, largely in response to what Greenback found. By late 1981, the situation had become a national political story. Miami's business leaders, tourism industry, and elected officials went to Washington directly, arguing that the city was being lost. In January 1982, the federal government created the South Florida Task Force under Vice President George Bush, which pushed military and intelligence resources into drug interdiction on a scale that had never been attempted domestically. Radar aircraft, Navy assets, additional agents and prosecutors all went into the region. Money on that scale also went into the institutions that were supposed to be stopping it. When a business generates more cash than the legal economy of an entire region, it finds the people in that region who can be bought, and it can pay more than any public salary. In 1985, a group of Miami officers was found to have been robbing drug loads themselves, using their badges to take product off boats and out of houses and then sell it. Men died during one of those robberies. Customs, ports, small banks, airstrips, and municipal government all sat somewhere on the same map. The courts were in no better shape. Prosecutors were handling a caseload that had multiplied in a few years, with jails past capacity and trial calendars measured in years, and defendants with real money hired the best lawyers in the state. That effort worked in one narrow sense and failed in a much larger one. Interdiction in the Caribbean did make the direct route from Colombia to South Florida harder and more expensive. Over the following years, the traffic shifted west, through Central America and then through Mexico, which is the origin of every organization that dominates the drug trade today. The Caribbean route was closed by pushing the business somewhere else, and the somewhere else turned out to be worse. Inside Miami, none of it stopped the killing in the short term. Bodies kept turning up through 1981 and 1982 at a rate that made the earlier years look calm. By that point, South Florida was handling an estimated majority of all the cocaine and marijuana entering the United States. A national news magazine put the region on its cover that autumn and described a paradise in collapse. Tourism suffered. Businesses relocated. Residents who could afford to leave began leaving. The version of Miami that later showed up on television, all pastel and speedboats, was a stylized rewriting of a period that people who lived through it remember as frightening. Griselda Blanco spent those years in the middle of it, moving between houses in Miami-Dade and using a rotation of names. Investigators later counted something close to 20 aliases attached to her. She changed her appearance regularly, gaining and losing weight, changing her hair, using different documents in different places. There is no photograph of her from that period that federal agents were able to reliably match to the woman under indictment in New York. Her business kept expanding anyway, and so did the number of people with a grievance against her. The economics of the trade guaranteed that. Every load fronted on credit created a debt. Every debt created a dispute, and Blanco resolved disputes one way. Accounts from people who worked with her describe her ordering killings over amounts of money that were small relative to what she was earning, and over things that were not about money at all. Insults. Disrespect. A man who had said something about her in a room she was not in. The people around her in that period included some of the more significant figures in the American end of the Medellin trade. Rafael Cardona Salazar, a Colombian trafficker operating in Miami, worked alongside and eventually against her. Max Mermelstein, an American who managed logistics for Colombian traffickers moving product into Florida and later became one of the most important cooperating witnesses the government ever had, moved in the same circles. Mermelstein described Blanco in terms that were not admiring. The people who worked in that trade were not squeamish men, and a number of them said plainly that she frightened them. Her cocaine use increased through those years. So, by every account from people who were around her, did her suspicion of the people closest to her. A trafficker who is convinced that the people working for her are stealing, and who has already demonstrated what she does about theft, produces an organization where the safest thing an employee can do is leave the country. What she had built by 1981 was a distribution network reaching from Miami into New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and half a dozen other cities, supplied directly from Medellin, with an enforcement arm that could put a shooter anywhere in the United States within a day and remove him just as fast. She was one of a small number of people in the country operating at that level, and she was doing it while under a federal indictment that had been sitting open for 6 years in a district she never entered. The number of deaths attributed to her over the whole of her career is the single most repeated figure in her story and the least reliable. The common claim is more than 200. Some investigators who worked the era used that number, and some used a smaller one, in the range of 40, which is closer to what could be documented case by case. The figure of 200 appears to have grown out of the total number of killings in South Florida that CENTAC investigators considered connected to Colombian trafficking organizations during her active years, which is not the same thing as killings she ordered. She was eventually convicted of 3. Everything above that number is an estimate made by people who watched the bodies accumulate and formed a view about where they came from. That view was not baseless. What detectives kept encountering was a pattern rather than a set of unconnected cases. The same method, the same weapons, victims who all turned out to have been in business with the same supplier, and killers who were never in the country long enough to leave a trace. What the pattern lacked was a witness. Nobody who had worked inside that organization had ever survived leaving it and then talked to an American police officer. For most of the war, the entire structure of the case against her rested on that gap. Investigators knew what she was. They could not prove any single thing she had done, because the only people who could describe her orders were the people who had carried them out, and those people were either in Colombia or dead. That changed because of one man who did the work for years, kept a remarkable amount of it in his head, and eventually decided that talking was worth more to him than loyalty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. He was arrested for something that had nothing to do with Miami, in a city 1,000 miles away, and it took the agents holding him a while to realize who they had. When he started talking, he described a system for killing people that ran on a phone call, a rental car, and a set of instructions that never came from the same room twice. Section 6. Rivi Jorge Ayala was Colombian, and inside Griselda Blanco's organization he was known as Rivi. In the files detectives were building, before they knew who he was, he existed only as a nickname they had picked up from informants. They were looking for a man called Riverita, and they had no face and no legal name to attach to it. He came into the organization the way most of the people around her did, through the Miami Colombian trade in the late 1970s, and he moved up because he was reliable. He drove. He carried. He organized. Eventually, he was the person Blanco called when she wanted somebody dealt with, which made him one of the few people in the structure who heard the instructions directly and stayed in the country afterward. What ended that arrangement had nothing to do with Miami. Ayala was arrested in connection with a bank robbery in Chicago. It took the people holding him a period of time to work out that the man in their custody on a robbery charge was the enforcer that homicide detectives in Florida had been trying to identify for years. Once they did, and once Ayala decided that cooperating served him better than the alternative, he began describing the operation from the inside. Over a long series of interviews with Miami-Dade detectives, he laid out how the killing had actually been organized. The account he gave is the single most important source of information that exists about how Blanco's organization worked, and it is also an account given by a man negotiating for his own life, which is exactly how it should be treated. The system he described was simple, which is why it worked. An order came by telephone. It did not include the word kill, and it usually did not include a full name. The person on the other end was told who the problem was, where the problem could be found, and that the problem needed handling. There was no meeting where the order was given in a room with witnesses. Blanco could give an instruction from a house in Miami-Dade to a man who would then never speak to her again about it until it was done. The crew was assembled locally by whoever took the call. Cars were rented, borrowed or stolen, and they were not connected to anyone. Weapons came out of a stash held somewhere separate from where anyone lived. Machine pistols were the standard tool, because they were small enough to carry under a jacket and put out enough fire to end a matter in a few seconds without requiring anyone to be a good shot. The people who did the shooting were frequently young, frequently new to the country, and frequently gone within days. A man brought up from Medellin for a job had no ties to Miami at all. He did not know the victim, he did not know the neighborhood, and he could not have identified the person who ordered the killing if he had wanted to, because he had never been in a room with her. He was paid a few $1,000s, or given a small quantity of product he could turn into money, and put on a plane home. That structure is why the killings did not solve. An American homicide investigation runs on relationships. Detectives look at who the victim knew, who had a reason, who was seen nearby, and they work through the connections until something holds. Blanco's method removed every connection. The shooter had no relationship with the victim, the person who arranged it had no relationship with the shooting, and the person who ordered it had no relationship with anything. Ayala also described the motorcycle work, and what he added was why it suited that particular city. Miami is built on wide roads with constant congestion and long stretches where a car sits still at a light with nowhere to go. A bike can leave a scene through gaps a police car cannot follow. The other thing he described was the culture of the organization, and it is the part detectives found hardest to accept. Blanco paid well, gave gifts, threw parties, and kept the people who worked for her close. She also ordered the deaths of people who worked for her, sometimes over small amounts of money, and sometimes over things that were not about money at all. Working for her carried a level of risk that had nothing to do with police. Detectives spent months debriefing Ayala. What came out of it was a set of names and dates attached to killings that had been sitting open in Miami-Dade files for a decade. He was able to describe scenes in detail that had never been made public, which is the standard test investigators use for whether an informant is inventing. In multiple cases, the detail matched. He eventually admitted involvement in a large number of killings. The figure most often attached to him is around 30. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to 3 murders and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. If he is ever released, he is to be deported to Colombia. What his account gave prosecutors was the one thing they had never had, which was a person who could put Blanco's voice on the other end of the phone. It also gave detectives an understanding of something that had confused them for years. The killings attributed to her organization did not follow the logic of a business protecting its margins. Some of them did, and those were the ordinary enforcement killings that every trafficking organization commits. A substantial number of them did not. People were killed for insults, for gossip, for having been present when something embarrassing happened, and in at least one case, according to Ayala, because a man had once kicked one of her sons. The process of turning what he said into something usable took years, and it is worth understanding because it is the reason the case took as long as it did. A cooperating witness is not simply believed. Detectives break an account into individual verifiable claims and check each one against material the witness could not have known unless he was telling the truth. Where the car was parked, what the room looked like, which door was used. Investigators sitting across from Ayala had crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, and evidence logs from killings years earlier that had never been described publicly, and they used them as a test. He passed enough of them to be taken seriously. He also got things wrong, misremembered dates, and gave versions that shifted between sessions, which is what happens when anyone is asked to recall dozens of events across a decade. Every one of those inconsistencies would eventually be available to a defense lawyer. The other thing an account like his produces is a map. Detectives had been treating the killings as separate cases across multiple jurisdictions. What Ayala gave them was the structure connecting them, which allowed old files to be pulled and re-examined together for the first time. The Lorenzo case is the clearest example of the ordinary kind, and it is one of the 3 killings that eventually stuck to her. Alfredo and Griselda Lorenzo were a married couple living in Miami who dealt cocaine. They had taken delivery of product from Blanco's organization and had not paid for it. The amount involved was significant by the standards of a street-level operation, and trivial by the standards of what she was earning in a week. In 1982, they were shot to death at their home. Their children were in the house. The killings were investigated at the time, and went nowhere, like nearly everything else in that period. There were no witnesses who would speak. There was no physical evidence pointing anywhere. The couple were known to police as people involved in the drug trade, which in Miami, in 1982, put their case into a category of hundreds of similar cases with the same characteristics and the same outcome. A decade later, Ayala described exactly how it had happened and who had ordered it. What made the Lorenzo case useful to prosecutors was that it was comprehensible. A supplier was owed money, the debtors did not pay, and the supplier had them killed. That is a motive a jury can follow. It fits the model of organized crime that people already understand, and it does not require anyone to explain why a woman running a business worth millions would spend resources killing a person over something that was not money at all. The other kind of killing was harder to explain, and there were a lot of them. According to the accounts given by people who worked for her, Blanco ordered deaths over insults. A man who had spoken about her in a way she heard about. A woman who had been involved with a man she was involved with. Someone who had witnessed her being humiliated. In the trade, that behavior read as instability, and it made people around her careful about what they said in rooms where anyone might repeat it. It also made her difficult to model. Law enforcement approaches an organized crime figure by working out what the person wants and predicting the behavior from that. Blanco wanted money, and she also wanted things that had nothing to do with money, and there was no reliable way to tell in advance which one was operating on a given day. The people who did the actual shooting are the part of this that usually gets skipped, and they were mostly young men from the same hillside neighborhoods Blanco herself had come out of. A teenager from a comuna in Medellin in the early 1980s had roughly the same set of options she had faced 30 years earlier, which is to say almost none. What was on offer now was a plane ticket, a few $1,000s, and a job that took an afternoon. Some of them had done this kind of work before. A number of them had not, which is visible in how badly some of the killings were carried out. They also had no protection at all. A man brought in for a job had no standing in the organization, no relationship with anyone above the person who collected him from the airport, and no recourse if something went wrong. Failing a job carried an obvious risk. Talking afterward carried a worse one. Several of the deaths investigators attributed to Blanco's organization were people who had worked for it. The reach was national. Killings connected to her organization were investigated in New York, in Illinois, in California, and in Florida. That spread was a direct product of her distribution network. She had wholesalers in multiple cities, and every wholesaler was a potential debtor, and every debtor was a potential problem. The men she used could be on a flight the same afternoon. For the detectives building the file, the reach created its own obstacle. A killing in Queens and a killing in Kendall are handled by two different departments, in two different states, under two different case numbers, by detectives who have no reason to ever speak to each other. Nobody was collecting those cases in one place. The pattern only became visible once someone inside the organization sat down and described it. Even with Ayala talking, the legal problem was real. An informant's account, however detailed, is one man's word, and this particular man had admitted to around 30 killings and was speaking in exchange for consideration on his own sentence. A defense attorney does not need to prove that such a witness is lying. He only needs a jury to consider that he might be. So prosecutors and detectives spent years doing the slower work. They went back to the old files, matched what Ayala described against physical evidence that had been collected at the time, tracked down people who had been near those scenes, and tried to build cases where his account was the frame rather than the foundation. That work took most of the 1980s and into the 1990s, and by the time it produced anything, Blanco had already been in federal prison for years on a completely different matter. Ayala stayed in the Florida prison system. He was denied parole in 2012. His attorney argued for years afterward that prosecutors had made commitments to him back in 1993 about supporting his release after 25 years, and courts declined to explore it. Whatever he was promised, and by whom, he is still serving a life sentence. What he handed investigators, in the end, was the architecture of an organization that had operated for a decade inside American cities, without a single one of its orders ever being written down. And one case he described in detail was different from all the others, in a way that changed how everyone who worked it thought about the person giving the orders. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The target was a man who had worked as an enforcer for her organization and had fallen out with her over something small. The instruction was to kill him in his car. What the crew actually did, on a road in Miami in March 1982, was shoot into a vehicle carrying a father and his 2-year-old son. Section 7. March 1982. Jesus Castro, known as Chucho, had worked as an enforcer connected to Blanco's organization. At some point, the relationship broke. The reason given in the accounts that came out later was not a debt and was not a shipment. It was a physical altercation involving one of her sons. In one telling, Castro had kicked the boy during an argument. Whatever the exact trigger, Blanco decided Castro was going to be killed, and the instruction went out through the usual channel. On a day in March 1982, in Miami, Castro was driving. In the vehicle with him was his son, Johnny Castro, who was 2 years old. The crew found the car and opened fire into it. Castro survived. The child did not. Johnny Castro was hit in the head and died. Ayala, who described the killing to investigators years afterward, gave an account of what happened when the result was reported back. Blanco was initially angry because the man they had been sent for was still alive. When she was told the son had been killed instead, her response, according to Ayala, was that she was pleased and that they were now even. That sentence is the reason this particular case became the center of everything that followed. It is a statement attributed to her by a cooperating witness, not something she ever said in a courtroom or on a recording. It has been repeated in every account of her life since, and it should be understood as Ayala's account rather than as established fact. What is established is that a 2-year-old boy was shot to death in a car in Miami in March 1982, that the shooting was carried out by people working for Griselda Blanco's organization, that the intended target was the child's father, and that Blanco eventually pleaded guilty to a charge arising from that killing. The Castro case changed the temperature of the investigation. Detectives who had spent 3 years working killings between adults who were all in the drug business and who had developed the professional distance that work requires did not have that distance available for a 2-year-old. Ayala's account of her reaction, delivered flatly in a debriefing room, is the thing the men who worked the case have talked about ever since in interviews. It is also the count that Miami-Dade prosecutors later built their death penalty case around. The other thing worth stating is what the killing revealed about how the organization actually operated. This was not a calculated act of intimidation. It was a botched shooting carried out by men firing into a moving vehicle without confirming who was inside it, which is what happens when the people doing the work have been in the country for a few days and have been given a car and a description. Blanco's own family life ran alongside all of this, and it followed the same logic. Her third husband, Dario Sepulveda, was the father of her youngest son, Michael. The marriage did not survive Miami. In 1983, Sepulveda left her, went back to Colombia, and took Michael with him after a dispute over the boy. What happened next is one more thing that everybody repeats and nobody has proven. Sepulveda was killed in Colombia, and the killing has been attributed to Blanco in every account written since. Michael was returned to her in the United States. There was no Colombian prosecution, no named suspect, and no case file that anybody has produced. It is the third of the 3 husbands she is said to have had killed, and like the first 2, the claim rests on the accounts of people in the trade and on a reputation that by that point was doing most of the work. Her 3 older sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo, were grown by then and were in the business with her. All 3 were involved in trafficking. All 3 eventually faced American charges in roughly the same period she did. She had brought them up inside the operation from the time they were teenagers, and there was never any indication that she considered doing otherwise. What that meant in practice is worth stating, because it is one of the few areas where the record is not in dispute. Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo did not drift into the trade. They were brought up inside it by their mother, given roles as soon as they were old enough to be useful, and moved into positions of responsibility in an operation where the standard method of resolving a disagreement was a killing. By their 20s, all 3 were traffickers, and all 3 were carrying the exposure that came with it. Michael, the youngest, has spoken publicly about his own childhood in the years since, and the picture he describes is of a boy who was surrounded by armed men, who moved house constantly, and who did not understand what any of it was until much later. He was 6 when federal agents came through the front door of the house in Irvine, and the only reason he was not inside for it was that a nanny had taken him to a park 10 minutes earlier. By 1983 and into 1984, her position in Miami was deteriorating from several directions at once. The federal pressure on South Florida had increased sharply after the task force stood up in 1982. Interdiction was working well enough to raise costs and disrupt routes. Prosecutors had begun bringing large conspiracy cases. Money laundering investigations were reaching into the banks that had been handling the cash without questions. Inside the trade, she had made a great many enemies. Every killing she had ordered had left behind people with a reason to come for her. and the ordinary protection that a large organization provides, which is that nobody wants a war, had eroded because she had been starting wars for 5 years. Accounts from the period describe her as increasingly certain that people around her were plotting against her, and increasingly willing to act on that certainty, which produced more of exactly what she was afraid of. There is also a claim, repeated in several accounts, that the Medellin leadership had come to regard her as a liability. The reasoning given is that the organization's business depended on volume moving quietly, and that a distributor whose disputes ended with shootouts in shopping malls was bad for everyone. That claim comes from interviews given years later and has never been documented. What can be said is that by 1984, she no longer had the protection in Miami that she had enjoyed in 1979. The era is usually described as traffickers killing traffickers, and that description does not survive contact with the record. Firing a machine pistol into a moving car on a public road does not produce a controlled outcome. Rounds go through the vehicle and continue, into other cars, into buildings, into people on a sidewalk. Miami in those years recorded people hit in restaurants, in traffic, and in their own homes, by gunfire aimed at somebody else. What the Castro case did was remove any possibility of describing the violence as self-contained. A 2-year-old in a car seat is not a participant in a drug dispute by any definition anybody could construct. The case then sat, unsolved, for the better part of a decade. Miami-Dade detectives knew roughly what had happened, and could not prove it. The father survived and was himself a man with a history in the trade, which limited how much help he was able or willing to be. There were no witnesses who would come forward. The shooters had been gone within days. That is the pattern of the entire period, compressed into one file. Investigators with a strong idea of who was responsible, no admissible way to demonstrate it, and a case that stayed open until somebody on the inside decided to talk 10 years later. Inside the organization, the killing appears to have changed nothing at all. There is no indication in any account that it caused a pause, a reconsideration, or any consequence for the people who carried it out. The work continued the following week the way it had the week before. That is the part the people who investigated her have kept returning to in interviews ever since. Not the scale of the trafficking, which was matched or exceeded by plenty of other organizations, and not the number of killings, which nobody can pin down. What they describe is the absence of any point at which a decision got harder. Her personal condition had deteriorated alongside her position. Accounts from people who spent time around her in that period describe heavy cocaine use, erratic hours, and a level of suspicion that made ordinary business difficult to conduct. She kept armed men close and moved between residences. Somewhere in 1984, she left Miami and went to Southern California. The move made sense on several levels. Her older sons were operating there, which gave her an existing structure to plug into. Orange County was a long way from the detectives who had been building files on her for 5 years, and from the people in Miami who had reasons to kill her. Southern California in the mid-1980s was also the fastest-growing cocaine market in the country, and the distribution routes that had once run everything through Florida were already shifting west. She settled in Irvine, an affluent, planned, quiet city in Orange County, in a house in a residential neighborhood. She lived under a false name with false identification. Michael, who was around 6, lived with her and had a nanny. Neighbors had no idea who she was. That is the arrangement that everything about her career had been building toward, and it is also, in a way, the thing that finished her. A woman running a national distribution network out of Miami, moving between safe houses under a rotation of names, is close to impossible to find. A woman living in a single suburban house in Irvine, with her youngest son and a nanny, is a fixed address. Going home was not an option in the way it had been in 1975, and the reason is one of the more important legal shifts of the period. Colombia and the United States had signed an extradition treaty that took effect in 1982. For the first 2 years, it was worth almost nothing, because the Colombian president made clear he did not intend to enforce it, and no Colombian national was surrendered under it. That changed on April 30, 1984, when the Colombian Justice Minister, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, was shot dead in Bogotá by gunmen on a motorcycle. He had been pursuing the Medellin traffickers directly. His killing triggered a state of siege and a decision by the Colombian government to begin using the treaty. The first Colombian citizens were extradited to the United States in January 1985. That is what closed the door behind her. For a decade, Returning to Colombia had been an absolute defense against an American indictment. Within the space of a year, it stopped being one. And it stopped being one at exactly the moment the Medellin organization went to war with its own government and made Colombia a considerably more dangerous place for a trafficker with enemies. So she stayed in the United States, in a country where she had been under federal indictment since 1975, under a name that did not belong to her, in a house with a lawn. Back in Miami, the work on her had never stopped. Detectives kept building the homicide files. Federal agents kept looking for a way to put a body on the 10-year-old indictment. The people who had been chasing her since the Queen's years had never closed the case, because the case had never been resolved, only paused. One of those people had been waiting since the beginning. Bob Palumbo had been a young federal agent in New York when the Operation Banshee case was assembled, and had been part of the effort that produced the 1975 indictment with her name on it and no photograph attached. He had watched her leave the country before anyone could touch her. Years later, he was reassigned to Miami, and by the mid-1980s, he was working the California end of the same investigation that had started in Queens a decade earlier. The way in was through her sons. The DEA had a cooperating informant who was in contact with the family's operation in California, and the surveillance built out from there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. On a spring afternoon in 1984, an agent running surveillance in Southern California caught sight of a woman he had spent 9 years trying to put a face to. He did not arrest her that day, and the decision not to would be argued over in federal court for the next 4 years. Section 8. Irvine, February 17, 1985. On May 30, 1984, Bob Palumbo was conducting surveillance in Newport Beach, California, and saw Griselda Blanco. He did not arrest her. That decision was made deliberately and was later defended in open court. At a hearing on November 30, 1987, Palumbo testified that taking her that day would have exposed the DEA's informant to being identified and killed, and would have destroyed an ongoing investigation into her sons. The district court found that testimony credible. The cost of the decision was immediate. Between May and September of 1984, the government lost her completely and had no idea where she was. In September, she surfaced again, seen delivering cash to the same informant. After that, through to the following February, the DEA had only occasional and unreliable information about where she was living. She was using a false name. She would not give the informant a telephone number or an address. So they worked the people around her instead, and the way in was her son, Osvaldo. Agents set up on a car dealership and waited. The informant was positioned to run into Osvaldo as though by accident, and the meeting took. The two of them went out for the night. When it was over, agents followed the bodyguards home, and the address they went to was a house in Irvine. Early on the morning of February 17, 1985, agents had the house covered. They watched the front door open. Michael Corleone Blanco, 6 years old, came out with a nanny to go to the park. Griselda appeared on the porch behind him to kiss him goodbye, then went back inside. The boy and the nanny walked away up the street, which is the only reason he was not in the house for what happened next. Palumbo walked up and knocked on the front door. An older woman opened it. He has said since that he never established who she was and suspects it may have been Blanco's mother. Agents moved through the house. Palumbo went up the stairs and into a bedroom and found Griselda Blanco sitting in bed. He told her they had finally met. She gave the agents a false name. She was carrying false identification papers. 10 years after a federal grand jury in New York had charged her without ever obtaining a photograph of her face, the woman on that indictment was in custody in a bedroom in Orange County. She was taken to New York to answer the 1975 case. The trial ran in federal court in Manhattan in June and July of 1985. The charge was conspiracy to manufacture, import into the United States, and distribute cocaine. The jury convicted her on that count. Her lawyers then moved to have the indictment dismissed on the grounds that she had been denied a speedy trial, arguing that the government had sat on a case for a decade. On November 6, 1985, the district court denied the motion, finding that the delay had been caused by Blanco herself, who had left the country and lived under false names for 10 years. 2 days later, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison and fined $25,000. The appeal that followed ran for years and turned on the same question. In December 1985, the appeals court sent the case back for a new hearing on the speedy trial issue, after documents were unsealed, describing the DEA's 1984 California investigation into her sons and the reasons agents had chosen not to move on her in May of that year. The district court held the hearing, heard from Palumbo and from a prosecutor about the extradition situation, and in January 1988 denied the motion again. The Second Circuit affirmed her conviction later that year. That litigation is worth a note, because it came close to undoing the whole thing. The argument her lawyers made was not that she was innocent, it was that the government had known where she was, had chosen not to take her, and had then used the 10-year gap it created as a reason to try her a decade after the fact. Courts take that seriously. A defendant has a right to be tried while the evidence and the witnesses are still available. What saved the conviction was the finding that she had caused the delay herself by leaving the country and living under names that did not exist, and the sealed material showing that the DEA had held off in May 1984 for reasons connected to protecting a human source and an ongoing case against her sons. 3 years of appellate argument turned on a decision one agent made in a parking lot in Newport Beach. 15 years was not what the people who had chased her thought the case was worth. Palumbo has said publicly since that he considered the sentence far too light for what she had been doing, and that he was unhappy with how the matter had been handled. From the perspective of a federal agent who had spent a decade on one defendant, the outcome was a drug conspiracy count, and a term she would not serve all of. Her 3 older sons went into the federal prison system in roughly the same period, on their own trafficking charges. She was 42 years old when she was sentenced. On the arithmetic available at the time, she would be released sometime in the 1990s, still young enough to start again, and that federal case, the only one anyone had ever managed to bring against her, said nothing whatsoever about Miami. It was a New York cocaine conspiracy from the 1970s. Every homicide file in Dade County with her name in it was still sitting exactly where it had been. The gap between what the government could prove and what it believed is the defining feature of her entire American legal history, and the 1985 conviction is the clearest illustration of it. A drug conspiracy charge is, in one sense, the easiest thing to prove against someone at her level, because it does not require the government to connect her to any particular kilogram. It requires an agreement to import and distribute, and evidence that she was part of it. Wiretaps, couriers, money movements, and the testimony of people below her can carry that. A homicide is the opposite. It requires a specific act, at a specific time, in a specific place, connected to a specific person, proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Blanco had spent 15 years building an operation designed to make that impossible, and it worked. The federal government put her in prison for an agreement she had made in the early 1970s. The killings in Miami were not part of the case at all, because there was nothing to charge them with. There is one more thing about the timing that should be said. She was arrested in February 1985. That is the same month the DEA agent Enrique Camarena was abducted and killed in Guadalajara, an event that redirected American drug policy toward Mexico for the next 4 decades. The Caribbean route that had built Miami was already being squeezed. The industry she had helped create in the United States was in the middle of relocating, and it relocated without her. She served most of her federal term in California, and by every account that exists, she did not stop working. Federal prison in the 1980s was not a place that cut a trafficker off from the outside. Telephones were available, visits were available, mail was available. A woman with money on the outside, family in the business, and a name that carried weight among Spanish-speaking inmates was in a position to keep running things at one remove, and multiple accounts describe her doing exactly that. The most detailed of those accounts comes from Charles Cosby, and it needs a warning attached to it before anything else. Cosby was a cocaine dealer from Oakland, California. He has said he first became interested in Blanco after seeing a television report about her, wrote to her in prison, and began visiting. The relationship became personal and, according to him, commercial. He has described her arranging supply for him, using him to move product and money on the outside, and treating him as her main link to the world beyond the prison. Nearly everything the public knows about Blanco's prison years comes from Cosby, primarily through interviews he gave for a documentary released in 2008, and through the many interviews he has given since. He is the only source for most of it. He has an obvious interest in the story being as large as possible, and none of it has been tested in a courtroom. The most famous claim he makes is the one that should be treated with the most caution. Cosby has said that Blanco developed a plan to have John F. Kennedy Jr. kidnapped, with the intention of trading him for her own release. That story has been repeated in nearly every article and documentary about her for 20 years. There is no indictment, no recorded conversation, no arrest, and no corroborating witness. It exists because one man says it happened. What is documented is that while she sat in federal custody, prosecutors in Miami were finally assembling the case that mattered. The turning point was Jorge Ayala. Once he began cooperating, Miami-Dade homicide detectives had someone who could describe the inside of the organization, and they spent years testing what he told them against files that had been open since the early 1980s. Nelson Andreu, who became a police chief in West Miami, spent roughly 10 years of his working life building that case. In 1993, Ayala pleaded guilty to 3 murders and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. His cooperation agreement made him the state's witness against the woman he said had given the orders. In 1994, the state of Florida charged Griselda Blanco with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The 3 were the killing of 2-year-old Johnny Castro in March 1982, and the killings of Alfredo and Grisel Lorenzo, the married couple who had failed to pay for a delivery. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. She was moved from federal custody back to Miami to face it. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office had a witness who could describe the phone calls, a set of homicide files that had been worked for a decade, and a defendant whose reputation preceded her into every room. The prosecution team believed the case was as strong as anything of its kind ever gets, and given what Florida juries did with capital cases in the 1990s, the expectation among the people who had chased her since 1979 was that this was finally the end of it. The case never reached a jury. What ended it had nothing to do with the evidence, nothing to do with the defense, and nothing to do with any legal argument about what Blanco had or had not ordered. It came out of the prosecutor's own office, and by the time the details became public, the state's position had collapsed so completely that the woman facing 3 counts of first-degree murder was in a position to negotiate. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The problem was discovered inside the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office itself, and it involved the state's own witness, a telephone, and 3 members of the office staff. Once it was documented, the case that 10 years of police work had produced was worth almost nothing. Section 9. The case that fell apart. Jorge Ayala was serving a life sentence and was the most important witness the state of Florida had. He was also, it emerged, spending a considerable amount of his time on the telephone with women who worked in the office that was prosecuting the case. 3 secretaries employed at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office were found to have been having sexually explicit phone conversations with him. Reporting on the matter, including in the Miami Herald, described money and gifts moving from Ayala to the women and photographs being exchanged. 3 staff members were fired. One of the 3 was later cleared of wrongdoing. Set against 3 murder charges, a 2-year-old shot in a car, and a decade of homicide files, a phone scandal involving office staff sounds like a footnote. In the context of a capital prosecution, it was fatal, and it is worth explaining why. A cooperating witness in a murder case is the most attackable thing a prosecutor can put in front of a jury. He has admitted to killing people. He is testifying in exchange for consideration. The defense will spend its entire cross-examination establishing that he has every reason in the world to say what the government wants him to say. The only counter a prosecutor has is to show that the relationship between the state and the witness was clean, documented, and at arm's length. That was no longer available. The state's witness had a personal relationship with employees of the prosecuting office. He had been given things. Nobody could say with confidence what else had been discussed on those calls, what he had been told, or whether anything about his account had been shaped by people inside the office. Every conversation between the state and Ayala, over years of preparation, was now open to a suggestion that the process had been contaminated. There were also disclosure obligations. Anything that could undermine the credibility of a state witness has to be handed to the defense. The scandal generated a large amount of exactly that material, and it went to defense lawyers who had been looking for a way to take Ayala apart and now had one delivered to them. Prosecutors were left choosing between 2 impossible options. They could take the case to trial with a witness whose credibility had been destroyed by their own office, in a death penalty prosecution where the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, and risk an acquittal on all 3 counts. Or they could make a deal. They made a deal. In 1998, Griselda Blanco pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years on each count, to be served concurrently, which meant 20 years total rather than 60. With credit for the time she had already served, and with that time running alongside her federal sentence, the practical effect was that she would be released a few years later. For the killing of Johnny Castro, for the killing of Alfredo Lorenzo, and for the killing of Griselda Lorenzo, that was the total legal result. The detectives who had worked those files for 15 years have not been quiet about how they felt. Nelson Andreu, who spent about a decade on the case, and Al Singleton, who had been on her since the Centac days, both spoke publicly afterward about a prosecution that had been solid on the facts and was lost on something that had nothing to do with the facts. The men who did the work watched a first-degree murder case involving a 2-year-old child turn into a plea to a lesser charge because of telephone calls made from a prison to an office. Ayala's own situation did not improve either. He remained in prison serving life. Years later, his lawyer argued that prosecutors had made informal commitments back in 1993 about supporting parole after 25 years, and that the scandal had been used to discard those commitments. In 2012, he was denied parole. Courts declined to examine the claims about what he had been promised. The wider point is not that the system was corrupt. It is that a case built entirely on the word of one participant is fragile in ways that have nothing to do with whether the participant is telling the truth. And that was the design feature Blanco had been exploiting since the 1970s. The phone scandal was the specific thing that happened. Something else would have done the same job. Blanco stayed in custody through the rest of the 1990s and into the next decade. In June 2004, she was released and immediately deported to Colombia. She was 61 years old. The public explanation at the time involved her health. She had been a heavy smoker for decades and was reported to be suffering from serious heart and lung problems, and the account that circulated was that her release was connected to that condition. Charles Cosby, in interviews given years later, has disputed the health story. As with most things that come from Cosby, it is an assertion rather than a documented fact. What is certain is the arithmetic. She had been arrested in February 1985. She was released in June 2004. For a person credited by American investigators with more than 200 killings and convicted of 3 that came to a little over 19 years in custody, most of it served on a drug conspiracy charge from 1975. The deportation itself was routine. A foreign national who has completed a sentence for a serious offense is transferred to immigration custody and removed, and that is what happened. There was no negotiation, no ceremony, and no press conference. A woman who had been the subject of 2 decades of federal and state investigation was put on a plane and became Colombia's problem. What she took with her is not documented anywhere. The federal case in 1985 had produced a fine of $25,000, which is a trivial figure against what she had earned, and there is no public record of any substantial forfeiture. The money that came through her operation in the late 1970s and early 1980s went into cash, property, jewelry, and businesses across 2 countries, and most of it was handled by people who did not survive the decade. Whether anything was still waiting for her in 2004 is unknown. She went back to Medellin, to the city she had left as a woman in her 20s, and by every available account, she lived quietly there for the next 8 years. Her family did not survive the business she had raised them in. Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo Trujillo Blanco had all been in the trade from a young age, had all served American prison time in the same period their mother did, and had all returned to Colombia afterward. All 3 were dead before she was. The specific circumstances are poorly documented and the accounts conflict, with some placing the deaths in the 1990s and others in the following decade. Violence is the common thread in every version, which in Medellin in those years was the ordinary end for men doing what they were doing. Michael Corleone Blanco was the only one of the 4 sons who outlived her. He had been 6 years old and walking to a park with a nanny when federal agents took his mother out of a house in Irvine, and he grew up in the United States afterward. In 2011, he was arrested on cocaine trafficking charges in Florida. He was convicted, served a period of house arrest, and finished probation in 2018. He has since appeared in documentary television built around the families of traffickers and runs a clothing brand using the family name. By 2012, Griselda Blanco was 69 years old, living in Medellin, with 3 of her 4 sons dead, no organization, no money that anyone has ever documented, and an American criminal record that consisted of 1 drug conspiracy conviction and 3 pleas to second-degree murder. Her son has said she had become a born-again Christian in her last years. Whether that was a genuine change or a comfortable story told afterward is not something anybody can settle now. What is documented is that a great many people in Colombia and in the United States had reasons to want her dead, and that nothing about living quietly in Medellin removed any of them. The Medellin she came back to in 2004 was in the middle of being described to the world as a success story, and the description was not entirely wrong. Escobar had been dead for 11 years. The bombings had stopped. The city was building libraries in the hillside neighborhoods and running cable cars up the slopes to connect them to the center. Underneath that, the structure that organizes crime in Medellin had never gone away. It had consolidated, and by the mid-2000s, a great deal of it ran through an organization commonly called the Oficina de Envigado, which managed territory, collected from local operations and arbitrated disputes, including by arranging killings. The contract killing economy that Blanco's people had helped export from Miami in the early 1980s was by then a fully established local industry. The city also went through a violent stretch in exactly the years she was living there quietly, after the extradition of the man controlling the Oficina in 2008 set off a war between two of his lieutenants. She settled in Belén, in the southwest of the city, in a neighborhood of ordinary apartment blocks and small businesses. Accounts describe her as living without visible security and moving around the area normally. She was reported to have some involvement in real estate. Nobody has ever documented significant wealth in her possession at the end. Whether people around her knew who she was is a question with an obvious answer. Griselda Blanco was one of the most written about Colombians of her generation by 2004. A documentary released in 2006 had made her a familiar figure to American audiences, and a follow-up released in 2008 was built entirely around her. In Medellin, where the trade she came out of remains a live part of the city's economy, an older woman who had done what she had done would not have been anonymous for long. She had been out of the business since 1985 and had no organization to protect her. Every person she had ever crossed had spent 2 decades thinking about it, and a substantial number of those people, or their sons and brothers, were in the same city. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. On a Monday afternoon in September 2012, she went out to buy meat. She was standing at the counter of a butcher shop with her son's pregnant former partner beside her, having spent about half an hour there, when a motorcycle stopped outside, and the man on the back of it got off. Section 10. Belén, September 3, 2012. The shop was called Carnicería Cardizo, an open-fronted butcher's on a corner in the Belén district of Medellin. Blanco had been inside for around half an hour. She had bought roughly $150 worth of meat. With her was the pregnant former partner of one of her sons. Accounts of the exact hour differ. Some Colombian reporting put it late in the morning, other accounts in the middle of the afternoon. What every account agrees on is the sequence. A motorcycle carrying 2 men stopped outside. The man riding on the back got off, walked toward her, and fired twice into her head from close range. He then got back onto the motorcycle, and it left. She died there. The woman with her was not hurt. Griselda Blanco was 69 years old. No one has ever been arrested for it. Colombian police investigated and did not establish who the 2 men were or who sent them. The case has never been closed with an answer, and the list of people with a reason to want it done was long enough that investigators said openly there were too many possibilities to narrow. The method is the part that everyone noticed immediately, because it was the method her own organization had made famous. Billy Corben, the filmmaker whose documentary work introduced most Americans to her, described it as living by the motorcycle assassin and dying by the motorcycle assassin. An academic who has written on the drug trade called it a kind of poetic justice, delivered to her in the form she had delivered to so many others. Whether she personally invented the technique is not something anyone can prove. What is beyond dispute is that it was used on her on a Monday afternoon in her own city while she was carrying groceries. The theories about who ordered it have never gone past being theories. Old enemies from the Miami years and their families. People connected to her sons, all of whom had been in the trade and all of whom had died violently. Colombian figures with older grievances. Somebody who wanted the message the method carried. Colombian police never named a suspect, and no organization ever claimed it. The absence of an answer is not unusual, and that is the point worth making about it. Colombia's clearance rate for homicide has been poor for decades. A contract killing carried out by two men on a motorcycle, in a city where that arrangement can be purchased cheaply, and where the men who do it have no connection to the person paying, is close to unsolvable by design. She had built a career on exactly that gap in the system, and she died in it. There is one more possibility that gets raised and cannot be assessed, and it should be mentioned because it comes from the person who knew the case best. Bob Palumbo has said he does not like to speculate without evidence, and then offered a theory anyway. His view is that after her youngest son was arrested on trafficking charges in Florida, she may have provided information to American law enforcement in an attempt to help him, and that if she did, word of it could have reached people in Colombia. He was explicit that this is his own reading, and not something he can document. That is where the matter rests. A woman who had ordered an unknown number of killings was killed by two men whose names nobody knows, on the instructions of somebody nobody has identified, for a reason nobody has established. In Miami, the reaction among the people who had chased her was not complicated. Bob Palumbo, asked about her death, said he does not wish death on anyone, but that if anybody had earned it, she had. Detectives who had spent years on the homicide files gave interviews saying much the same thing. Her surviving son, Michael, was in Florida at the time, under house arrest and waiting on his own cocaine trafficking case. People who spoke with him afterward said that whatever the rest of the world thought about Griselda Blanco, she was his mother, and he was in pieces about it. She was buried in Medellin, in the city where she had been raised in a hillside neighborhood, by a mother who had nothing, and where she had started out picking pockets in the years after the violence that emptied the countryside. What she actually left behind, in terms of things that can be proven, is a short list. One federal conviction, in New York, for conspiracy to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine, arising from an indictment returned in April 1975. 15 years and a $25,000 fine. 3 pleas of guilty to second-degree murder in Florida in 1998, for Alfredo Lorenzo, for Grisel Lorenzo, and for 2-year-old Johnny Castro. 20 years, served concurrently. Deportation in 2004. That is the entire legal record of a person credited with running one of the largest cocaine distribution operations in American history, and with more than 200 deaths. Federal prosecutors in New York and state prosecutors in Florida spent a combined 2 decades trying to add something to that list, and neither of them managed it. Everything else that gets repeated about her sits somewhere on a scale between well-sourced and completely unverifiable, and it is worth separating them. Reasonably well supported, she pioneered the courier system that moved cocaine into the United States on the bodies of ordinary-looking women using forged documents. She built one of the first organized Colombian distribution networks in New York, at a time when the American cocaine market was small and disorganized. She was a major supplier in Miami during the most violent period in that city's history. She ordered killings, plural, including the 3 she admitted to. Detectives who investigated her over a decade all described the same person, weakly supported or unverifiable, the kidnapping and killing of a boy when she was 11 years old, which comes from accounts given decades later and appears in no record. The killing of all 3 of her husbands, which is repeated everywhere and prosecuted nowhere. The figure of more than 200 murders, which counts bodies she was never shown to have ordered. The plan to kidnap John F. Kennedy Jr., which rests entirely on the word of one man. The claim that she personally invented the motorcycle assassination. The reason the unverifiable material has traveled so far is that it has been carried by effective storytelling. A documentary released in 2006 about the Miami cocaine wars introduced her to a mass audience. A follow-up 2 years later was built around Charles Cosby's account of her prison years and put most of the unverifiable claims into general circulation. A television film followed in 2018. A Netflix series in 2024, with Sofia Vergara playing her, reached an audience larger than everything before it combined, and it was explicitly a dramatization rather than a documentary. Her surviving son publicly objected to that production and to the use of the family's story in it. Each retelling has been built on the one before it, and the unsourced claims have hardened with each pass, which is how a story attributed to a single interview subject ends up being repeated as biography. There is also the part of her legacy that has nothing to do with any of that, and it is the part that actually mattered. The courier and distribution model she helped build did not die with her operation. It became the standard structure for moving cocaine into the United States, and it was refined by organizations far larger than hers. The federal pressure that eventually made the Caribbean route expensive pushed the traffic west into Mexico, which is where the entire industry sits today. The contract killing method that her crews used in Miami went back to Colombia and became an industry there, and then spread further. And the specific human damage stayed exactly where it landed: the children who were in the Lorenzo house. A 2-year-old boy in a car in Miami in March 1982 who was killed because his father had a dispute with his father's employer. 2 liquor store employees at Dadeland who were working a shift. The people in the parking lot who found bullet holes in their cars. 3 of her own sons, raised inside the business from the time they were teenagers, all dead before she was. Miami itself is the strangest part of the inheritance. The money did not evaporate when the arrests started. It had already been converted into buildings, into land, into businesses that outlived everyone who founded them. The downtown skyline that appears on every postcard went up during the period the medical examiner was renting refrigerated storage, and a substantial part of the capital behind it had no legal origin. The buildings are still there. So are the families of the people who were shot. The people who worked the cases have all made roughly the same point over the years. The version of this story that reached the largest audience is the one where a woman from nothing builds an empire and is brought down at the end. The version they investigated is a series of open homicide files, most of which never closed. Scarface came out in December 1983, directed by Brian De Palma and written by Oliver Stone, who had researched the Miami cocaine trade while working on it. The story it tells is of a Cuban who arrives during the Mariel boat lift, takes over a drug operation through nerve and violence, and is destroyed by his own excess. Miami officials were unhappy enough with the portrayal that a substantial part of the production ended up being shot in California instead. The film became the reference point for the entire era, and for a lot of people it is still the only version of Miami in the early 1980s they have ever encountered. It was in cinemas while the real events were still running. The Dadeland shooting had happened 4 years earlier. Johnny Castro had been killed 21 months earlier. Griselda Blanco was still living in Miami-Dade County under a false name when audiences were watching a fictional trafficker take the city apart on screen. The differences are not about the level of violence, they are about shape. A film has to resolve. Tony Montana rises, overreaches, and dies in his own house at the end of a story that runs a little under 3 hours. The audience gets a beginning, a middle, and an ending, and the ending contains a judgment about what the character deserved. What actually happened in Miami had no shape like that. It ran for years without resolving. The killings did not build toward anything. The county recorded 600 homicides in a single year and rented refrigerated storage because the morgue was full, and then the following year it did it again. There was no final confrontation. The federal government pushed the routes west, and the traffic moved to Mexico, where the same industry is still running at a scale that makes the Miami years look small. And the woman at the center of the part of it covered here did not die at the end of her own story. She was arrested in a suburban bedroom in Orange County, served time on a drug charge from a decade earlier, watched a murder case against her collapse because of telephone calls made from a prison, pleaded to a lesser charge, was deported, and lived quietly for 8 years before 2 men on a motorcycle took 30 seconds outside a butcher shop. The other difference is the one that matters. A film about the drug trade is built around people in the drug trade doing things to each other, and the audience is allowed to enjoy it because everybody on screen chose to be there. The most remembered victim in the real record was 2 years old and was in a car with his father. Griselda Blanco was convicted of 1 drug conspiracy and admitted to 3 murders. She spent 19 years in American custody and died at 69, 8 years after she was released. Nobody has ever been charged with killing her, and nobody has ever been charged with the great majority of the killings her name is attached to. That is the version of the story that can actually be documented, and it is not the one that the films tell. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.